Good evening, NGH Washington members. This is Barbara Decker, and I am really pleased to be here with you um, for the chance for you to listen to my lecture on the book written by Thomas Verney, who is a psychiatrist in Toronto, Canada, and the book is called The Embodied Mind. And how I'm involved with this gentleman is that for years I have been exposed to the field of pre and perinatal psychology, also called APA, and with the website birthpsychology.com. Dr. Verney and David Chamberlain, a psychologist, were two therapists that work with patients sometimes during the pregnancy. And they actually had cases where when they were regressing their patients with hypnosis, that some of the patients actually went back to the womb and remembered their womb experience. So Thomas, being a psychiatrist, decided to ask these patients to go back to their families and ask about their pregnancy, what was happening during the pregnancy, what happened during the birth and their early childhood, without letting the parents know that they had a memory from the past. And David Chamberlain did the same thing. So they decided that they would present a paper to the American Psychiatric Association with this information, that they had evidence from the patients that the stories that they were remembering about their womb experience and birth and so forth were valid experiences that were supported by their parents. So they put together this paper, went to the Association of American Psychological Association, and they would not let them talk on the subject. And they did not believe that it was possible that there could be memories back before the child was 3 years old. So the two of them started the organization, the Association of Pre and Perinatal Psychology. It was actually called PRANA back then, and has been changed to the Association of Pre and Perinatal Psychology. So over the years, Dr. Verney has, as a psychiatrist, has had knowledge that, of course, we're working with the brain. And it's only been over the past 20, 25 years that there's been research from neuroscience that actually it isn't just the brain that remembers, it is also every cell in our body that has memories. So this is what's involved in this book, The Embodied Mind. So let me share some information with you. Okay, I mentioned about Dr. Thomas Verney, and he is a psychiatrist and has worked for years treating patients with psychiatric problems, and is just amazed at the difference in the information that has changed since he became a psychiatrist many years ago. And I'd like to read you one of the excerpts from the book that drew him to the idea that how can a person have memories within their body if they don't have a brain? So reading from page number 7 in the book, he said, what set me my path towards the embodied mind was an article I read 6 years ago, and it was reprinted from Reuters Science News. Tiny brain, no obstacle to French civil servant. In July 2007, A 44-year-old Frenchman went to a hospital complaining of mild weakness in his left leg. When the doctors learned that the man had a spinal shunt removed when he was 14, they performed numerous scans of his head. What they discovered was a huge fluid-filled chamber occupying most of the space in his skull, leaving little more than a thin sheet of actual brain tissue. It was a case of hydrocephalus, which is water on the brain, literally water on the brain. The hospital in Marseille was quoted as saying, "The images were most unusual. The brain was virtually absent. The patient was a married father of 2 children and worked as a civil servant, apparently leading a normal life despite having a cranium filled with spinal fluid and very little brain tissue." So he researches some more and found in the medical literature an astonishing number of documented cases of adults as children had parts of their brain removed to heal epilepsy. Following the hemispherectomy, most of the children showed not only an improvement into their intellectual capacity and sociability, but also apparent retention of memory, personality, and sense of humor. Similarly, the adults who have had hemispherectomies enjoyed excellent long-term seizure control and increased postoperative employability. So this is what drew Dr. Verney into writing this book. It was the catalyst to start him doing the research. And the reason he wrote this book, he now is convinced that our embodied mind is not the enskulled mind that he was always taught in medical school, that we have cellular memory in every one of our cells. The understanding that we have is that the blueprint of our bodies is in the genes. The blue eyes, the hair, the bone structure, the physical aspects of our bodies are definitely the blueprint for our bodies. But Bruce Lipton, a very famous cell biologist, did an experiment. He was cloning at the time in medical schools. He was cloning to duplicate cells and so forth. And something that he always questioned, he was taught, as most of us were taught, that the nucleus is the brain of the cell. So what Bruce Lipton did is he took a bunch of different cells, bone cells, muscle cells, blood cells, nerve cells, and put them in petri dishes and wanted to know how long these cells would live outside the body if he removed the nucleus. So, amazingly enough, the answer is all of the cells lived the same length of time outside the body without the nucleus as it would inside the body, which proved to Dr. Lipton that the nucleus is not the brains of the cell. As long as these cells were planted in a healthy agar, and usually in a blood agar with lots of nutrients, they breathed, they pooped, they exhaled, and they ate, and they survived outside that body for as long as they would have inside the body. That's when he was able to prove that the brain of the cell is the environment around the cells. He took another bunch of cells and put them in a toxic blood agar or agar to grow in. They shriveled up and died. That's when he started to term and make it easier for people to understand what epigenetics was. Epigenetics is above the genes, and the environment around a person, especially a pregnant woman, as she's growing a baby, that environment can change depending on the circumstances that she's living in. So the genes are the blueprint, but epigenetics can have an effect on the genes. It actually shortens the telomeres at the end of the genes. When it's constant stress, it affects those telomeres, and the genetic code does not pass on correctly to the offspring. This particular lady is not mentioned in Dr. Verney's book, and I'm surprised that she isn't, because she's one of my favorite researchers, and it's Marianne Cleves Diamond. She was a brain researcher who died when she was in her 90s, just a few years ago. She did experiments on rats, and she studied pregnant rats by putting them, some of the rats, pregnant rats, in cages where they had little food, they were crowded in, and they had very few toys to play with. And then she put another set of pregnant rats in another cage where they had lots of good food, no stress, lots of toys, and good and a good environment, enriched environment, she called it. And when the rat pups were born, the mother that was constantly under stress, those rat pumps did not get nurtured by their mothers. They didn't use licking behavior. Licking behavior is a nurturing among rats. They basically ignored their young. And so these rats were not nurtured when they were young. They basically ignored them. The rats that had the enriched environment were healthy. They were licked well by their parents. They were nurtured by their mother and grew up to be healthy rats. So they researched again and put the unnurtured rats with the nurtured rats, and it took almost 3 generations before the licking instinct came through with the pups of those previously stretched rats. 3 generations it followed through. And Marianne Diamond is the one that was able to prove this. Very, very famous researcher. Okay, things that can be epigenetic influences can be domestic violence, intergenerational stress, where there's a researcher called Rachel Yehuda out of New York that has been studying Holocaust victims. Their grandchildren, she has found, are carrying the stress of what their grandparents held when they were subject to the Holocaust. And so she is getting in connection with these grandchildren and doing research and finding out that they are genetically carrying through those stress effects from the Holocaust. There's also another example of intergenerational stress that actually happened physiologically when the Germans starved the Dutch people after World War II. They were living, basically, they had no food supply, and they were living, licking garbage cans practically to stay alive. When these pregnant mothers during that period of time were building their babies, the babies were built very small because there wasn't much of a food supply. So their kidneys were small, their hearts were small, their other organs were small, and they had a 20% of schizophrenia out of the generation, 2 generations going into the 3rd generation after all of that stress that those women went through. When they got on healthy food, because they had the small hearts and the small kidneys and so forth, they ended up with endocrine problems. They ended up diabetic, overweight, and had cardiac problems and died quite young. And the research shows that it took 3 generations for that detrimental experience in the womb to be repaired by nature, so that they could become healthy genetically in the long run. And this is all proved by the research that's being done. The psychological state of the mother. For years, people thought the psychological state of the mother had nothing to do with the baby that she was forming, and they were totally wrong. We now know that the state of the mother has a major influence on the way that the baby's brain grows, just as Marjorie proved with the stress hormones going through that mother. It's breaking through the placenta and having an effect on the baby, so that the baby's brain architecture is actually changed. The amygdala, the hippocampus is changed, so that these babies that are under constant stress they're wired for protection when they're born. We wonder why people are more hyperactive. Those babies are more hyper. They suffered a lot and received a lot of stress hormones when they were growing in the womb. When a baby feels loved and has a lot of oxytocin, the structures form, the nervous system forms, they're regulated, and those babies are calmer and they're going to be healthier. So this is why it's so critically important for us to, one, be aware of pregnancy and the importance of the gestational period. Also, social interactions, social engagement. Stephen Porges, a famous psychologist, has developed the polyvagal theory, which talks about not only do babies have a parasympathetic nervous system that reacts fight or flight. Oh, no, stress. Fight or flight is stress, and that's from the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is our calming nervous system. And we have a social engagement system where the baby tries to build a relationship from the moment that he's born. He's looking for his parents. This also is affected by what was going on within that womb when the woman is carrying this baby. Drugs have an effect. Gut microbiome has an effect on brain tissue. This is in and explained well in the Embodied Mind in this book. Exercise, keeping yourself healthy so that you're not getting overweight. Your financial status, whether you're stressed about finances, whether you're poor, all of these have an epigenetic influence on these babies that were growing in the womb. Drugs of abuse, toxic chemicals, diseases. There was a mosquito disease that came out of Mexico that was causing some babies to have no brain tissue whatsoever. And many of those babies did not survive. There are certain places in the world where the food supply, like Africa, is very, very low. So our own natural system does not allow us to get pregnant during a season where the babies are going to be born when there's a low supply of food. And this has also been researched over the past 30, 40 years. Our diet makes a big difference because it affects the microbiome. Divorce of stress of divorce, alcohol problems, being in prison, being adopted, and sexually or emotionally abused. All of these things are influencing these babies that we're bringing into the world and their early childhood. So it's above the genes that is controlling what's happening to us. And many organizations, psychological organizations, think, well, they used to think that the babies were a blank slate when they were born. And we now know that any of these epigenetic influences can change the structure of the brain and the body physiologically of these babies coming into the world. And since 45%, according to the Guttmacher Institute back in 2015, 45% of our babies coming into the world are not planned for, and 20%, 18 to 20% of that 45 are not even wanted babies. Not being wanted is one of the worst experiences for any baby to experience in the womb, when he's born, and after he's born. That is the first detrimental mark against a child. And it may take years for people to get over not being good enough, not being wanted, never recognizing what their challenges are, until somebody uncovers that it was the fact that they were never wanted. And it takes healing is possible. Healing is possible for lots of trauma, but it's going to take work, energy work, and not just the brain. Bessel wrote a famous book called The Body Keeps Score. And this is one of his quotes: "Your body, believe it or not, remembers everything: sounds, smells, touches, tastes, but the memory is not held in your mind. It's locked somewhere in the recess of your brain." Locked somewhere in the recesses of your brain. That's what we used to think. Instead, it's held in your body all the way down at the cellular level. So it was a revelation for Dr. Verney as a psychiatrist to be able to write this book and say, we need to do more than just psychiatric care, psychological care. We need to help our patients by using somatic methods to help the body release some of the stress that they're holding within their system. Now, when we think of sounds, smells, and touches, we know that in criminal cases, we have been able to pass on, often if you close your eyes and you're asked to remember what happened in a certain situation, it could be a smell of somebody's cologne. It could be a smell of manure. What sort of sounds did you hear? You might have been near a railroad station. You might have been near an airport. These things will come back to the surface of your mind when you close your eyes and go back to touch on the situation that may have been traumatic for you. So all of our different senses are involved, and not just the brain. So such touch. Many people have had sexual abuse in the touch. Therefore, they cannot stand to be touched. So the body is involved in healing as well as the brain and psychology. And we need to realize this. There's many schools that are teaching in psychology. They do not go back from conception all the way to the first 3 years, because they don't believe that the person, the baby, had the ability to remember their womb experience, their birth, and the first 3 years that they were born. So this is all new research that needs to be delved into, and have all of us that are working with people understand that there's a lot more to the story than what happened to somebody after 3 years old. Now, Dr. Folletti in California did studies on the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and he was absolutely amazed with his experiments, the number of people that are affected by adverse childhood experiences and how it affects them the rest of their lives. And that paper written by him with the ACEs is a fascinating paper that all of us should read. We also now need to go back to adverse pregnancy experience, prenatal experiences. So we need to expand that to go into the womb, into the birth, and then those first couple of years when they were little infants. What makes them tick? So that when you look at a person, you see a person, but there's a lot more underneath what you see. So this information is critical for those of us that are working in hypnotherapy, working in the prenatal field, working in massage. There's just so much that we need to wake up to, because neuroscience is proving that this information is correct. When we look at MASARU EMOTO, he is a Japanese gentleman that did experiments on how people's emotions could affect something as simple as water. And he took a bunch of people to a lake, and he had the people put out positive words, love, care, compassion to the lake. And then they scooped water out of the lake. And out of that lake, when they put the water under a microscope, they saw these beautiful water molecules that were all there. They were all shaped beautifully like snowflakes, and just were beautiful to look at. And then he had the people say, "Oh, you're ugly. You make me sick. You're mean. You're horrible." Negative aspects, and the water molecules change to these other ugly, strange shapes. Now, he also did it with a rice experiment where you had 3 jars of rice. And the first one, you would say something loving. The second one would be medium grade. And then the one would be really negative and nasty. And all you had to do was think about it. You didn't even have to say it. And look at those jars. The rice that got all the negative activity dried up, shriveled up, turned brown, whereas the medium one took a little longer before it disintegrated. And the jar that had the rice that was healthy, it lasted for a long, long time. So if you figure our body is 45 to 75% water, and we're doing a lot of negative thinking, why doesn't it make sense that we could have an effect of our emotions onto how our body is reacting, how our babies are growing in the womb? It just makes sense that this would be something we need to pay attention to. So his book, The Embodied Mind, is not, he's talking about the fact that it's not the old enskulled mind that he's been working on as a psychiatrist for many, many, many years. We've also got to include our body cells, a complete body as a whole, and how we can express trauma out of ourselves with somatic means. Now, it's interesting, an animal that's been traumatized, say you're an antelope and the lion is chasing after you. The antelope is, if he gets to safety, he plays dead, goes into parasympathetic freeze. The animal thinks he's dead, doesn't want anything to do with him. The chase is over. And then when the lion goes away, that antelope will go through a shaking experience and release all that trauma. And then he'll get up and run away. So it doesn't continue to build, that stress doesn't continue to build in his body over time. And we as human beings tend not to do that. We tend to hold things inside, and we don't get a chance to really express them in a healthy way. If we don't get a chance to express them in a healthy way, then they build up and then eventually explode. So we need a lot more mental health support by helping individuals that need to talk. They do their own healing. All we do when we're working with the people that we do, we're listening, and they are helping themselves recognize the things that were unhappy and challenging for them. Once they recognize them, there's lots of things that can be done. So EMDR is something that used often, somatic psychology. IEMT is something that I do, integral eye movement therapy, and it's very much like EMDR. Movement therapy, just moving your body can release certain types of trauma. Tapping, emotional release therapy that Scott has been talking about, and his simple exercise of playing with the ball, it gets the person's mind off what they're upset about. And he's had great success with emotional release therapy. Tensing and trauma release, TTR, is very successful in releasing tension. They use it with firefighters and policemen and so forth. And I had the experience of attending one of those classes, and I was amazed. You stress your muscles to a point, and then you lie down and then let those muscles just release through this shaking like the animals do. And it's amazing how the body will learn how to relax and release something. Dance therapy, body talk, polyvagal theory, just I was talking about from Dave Porges, and having a healthy gut, microbiota. The Embodied Mind, Thomas goes into how much a healthy gut can make a difference. He also goes into one-celled animals, like an amoeba. An amoeba is a one-cell animal, and he has studies that he talks about in the book, where if that amoeba moves near a particular area and it's shocked, then the amoeba knows not to go near that area again. Now, that's a one-cell animal, and yet it has a memory so that it doesn't go near where it was shocked, where it was the previous time. Another experiment, he talks about smell with, I think it was rats, where they did it where they were exposed to a particular smell, and then they were shocked. And the experiment was done long enough that the animal, when they smelled that smell, they expected to get the shock, even though it never came. And that fear of that smell actually continued through 3 generations of rats. So he talks about worms, one-cell worms, how they can go through mazes. And once they've been through the maze, they remember where to go. How can this happen if they don't have a nucleus and they don't have a brain? It's got to be within the cellular membrane, the epigenetics. And he explains it well in his book. Another interesting aspect from the book is how people that have had transplants like a heart, have had changes in their own desires, even with what they eat. There was a story of a man or woman that received a heart from a teenager, late teenager, and after the person received the heart, this person who had been a reasonably healthy person and ate well had this craving for something like fried chicken, craving for fried chicken. And when they had the chance to talk to the parents of the person that lost their child, they said that was one of his favorite foods. And now this person has that heart within their system. And it turns out now this person is craving that same food. So there's something in the cellular structure that is passing on memories, even for transplant patients. So this is a fascinating field that we must pay attention to in helping to understand that doing psychology work, doing psychiatric work isn't the only thing that needs to be done when somebody needs healing, that we must include the body also to change and express our cellular structure so that these patients and beings can be the person that they have a right to be. And the healing can start just by listening and having them have good therapy that can help them express it physically as well as psychologically. So I thank you all for joining me in this lecture. And my organization is the Association of Pre- and Perinatal Psychology and Health, also called APA. And its website is www.birthpsychology.com. My two websites are solabirthing.com and empoweringpregnancy.com, because my specialty is working with pregnant women and passing on the knowledge of what we know of the gestational period so that parents can prepare for bringing a healthy baby into the world. And that's my passion. So thank you for listening. And I'll take questions after the lecture. Thank you. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.